Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Michaela Klauser. I'm on the producer education team here at NCBA. Just a couple quick housekeeping items before we get started. As a participant, your line will be muted, but feel free to type in questions in the question box on your screen during the webinar, and at the end of the presentations, we will get to as many of those as time will allow. If you're having trouble with your technology, or if you're joining us only for the audio, the webinar is being recorded and will be available at ncba.org. Just look for the producer tab on the website. Tonight's webinar will feature our DC policy team. First, kicking us off is Ethan Lane, who is the Vice President of our Government Affairs team. Then Allison Rivera, who's the Executive Director of Government Affairs. Rebecca Barnett, Director of Animal Health and Food Safety Policy, Kip Backus, Executive Director of Government Affairs, Tanner Beamer, Senior Director of Government Affairs, and Sigrid Johannes, Director of Public Lands Council and NCBA Government Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us, guys. And Ethan, I'm going to pass it off to you.
Well, thank you, Michaela, and welcome everybody to the end of the year policy webinar here from the Washington, D.C. office of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. We're going to spend the next hour going through one of the wildest years we've seen in policy here on Capitol Hill in quite some time. For many of us, the wildest year we've ever seen. The picture you're seeing on the screen now is the best representation we could come up with of just what kind of year it's been around here. The only thing that is missing from this picture is if our producers in some parts of the country were getting the rain that they needed, that dumpster would be floating on a river while on fire. It has been one for the books here in Washington, D.C., and all of you, I know, have been following this saga at home from the very first days of this Congress in January, when we watched an unprecedented 15 rounds of voting to elect Kevin McCarthy as Speaker of the House, all the way through his departure just about a month and a half ago, or 2 months ago now, and 21 days of even more unprecedented leaderless action in the House of Representatives as the House Republican Conference found their way to a new speaker. We're going to get into the details of that fight tonight, and we're going to talk about the implications on all of our policy priorities that have been given to us by all of you across the country to implement here in this all-important Farm Bill renewal year, and in some of the regular order issues that we deal with here in Washington, D.C., like the appropriations process, like the ever-present regulatory work that the agencies are always churning out, and dealing with upcoming conditions that we see popping up around the country. We're going to start tonight with a little bit of time to frame up just what that political landscape has looked like. Tanner Beamer, for those of you that are at least my age, will remember the Micro Machines commercials with Mean Gene, the fastest talking man on TV. We're going to have Tanner go through this portion of the agenda because it's a lot of material to get through. So he's going to go through where we're at politically right now, how we got to the place that we are now, and what that looks like before we get into some of the individual policy areas this evening. So Tanner, with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ethan, and thanks everybody for joining this evening. I'm not just saying this because he's my boss. Ethan hit the nail right on the head. A dumpster fire doesn't even come close, but I think it's the only thing the English language can come up with to describe what's going on in Washington, D.C. Just to go over some of the basics, I think everybody is acutely aware of what's going on in Washington. You have President Joe Biden in charge of the White House, which means his cabinet secretaries like Tom Vilsack or Michael Regan or Deb Haaland are implementing his policy agenda from the executive side. Over in the United States Senate, you have Democrats controlling that body by a very, very narrow 51 to 49 margin. You'll see 3 yellow dots on that screen. Those are all independents, but they traditionally caucus with the Democrats, giving them that majority. Kristen Sinema is an interesting senator in that equation because she started this Congress as a Democrat and has since left the party. So that creates some interesting dynamics for Leader Schumer as he tries to move legislation across the finish line. And then over in the House of Representatives, we started out with 222 Republicans to 213 Democrats. That gave Speaker McCarthy, who took 15 ballots, like Ethan said, to get elected back in January, that leaves him only 5 votes that he can lose in order to pass legislation with Republican-only votes. And as you all have seen in recent days, that is something that is increasingly important to this House Republican conference. Unfortunately, however, because they are unable to move some of this legislation with Republican-only votes, Speaker McCarthy, in an attempt to try and keep the government open and stave off a government shutdown, led the charge to pass a continuing resolution to keep the government funded beyond September 30th of this year. In so doing, that bill passed with more Democratic support than Republican support, and Kevin McCarthy was subsequently removed for the first time in U.S. history as Speaker of the House of Representatives. Matt Gaetz was the leader of the charge on that, and he was temporarily replaced by a Speaker pro tempore. So after 9/11, Congress implemented some continuity of the body protocols, and the Speaker has to deliver to the House Clerk the name of a member of Congress who will replace the Speaker in the event the chair becomes vacated. That was taken over by Patrick McHenry. He's a Republican from North Carolina, strong McCarthy ally, and his sole purpose, beyond kicking Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer out of their plush Capitol offices, was to oversee the selection of a new Speaker to replace Speaker McCarthy. And I think everybody here knows just how crazy that was, that he got ousted from that position in the first place. On your screen, you will see 8 individuals, and these 8 people are the only Republicans who crossed party lines and voted unanimously with Democrats to remove Speaker McCarthy from the speakership and set off that almost 3-week race to replace him. In order to understand kind of why that happens and what's going on here, the Washington Post put this out. You're not usually going to hear me endorse something that the Post put out, but this is a pretty good layout of what kind of camps are going on in the Republican Party right now. To the very far left, you'll see the Problem Solvers Caucus. These are very, very moderate Republicans. They typically represent very urban districts, and they're very in tune to what their constituents are thinking. Oftentimes, they are running in either even districts or districts where Democrats have a pretty sizable advantage. Over on the very far right of that, you'll see the House Freedom Caucus, and you will hear our office talk about this caucus a lot. They are serial no votes on legislation, regardless of what party is pushing it, and they have caused massive problems in this 118th Congress in trying to advance any sort of a cohesive legislative agenda, and have been a big stumbling block, not just for Speaker McCarthy, but also for Speaker Ryan and Speaker Boehner before him. And then in the middle, you have groups like Republican Governance, Republican Main Street Caucus, and the Republican Study Committee that are different iterations of folks with focuses on different things. Republican Study Committee, they're a very conservative group, and you can see that represents the largest share of the Republican conference. Main Street Caucus, they pretty much focus entirely on economic issues, limited government, low regulations, and tax breaks for Main Street. And the Republican Governance Group, think Mitt Romney when you think of a group like this. They really are interested in doing those things which the government is supposed to do, like funding the government. They just want to do it responsibly. And there are a lot more camps besides just these 5, and a lot more ways to bucket members of the Republican conference beyond just these 5 families. So in the rush to replace Speaker McCarthy, we started with the obvious choice, the number 1 Republican to Kevin McCarthy, which is Majority Leader Steve Scalise. He won his conference vote with 113 to 99. That caused him some trouble, because you can see there's already some opposition to his speaker candidacy in the House Republican Conference. He actually went and declined to go to the floor for a vote because of the opposition that he knew that he was going to receive. And so with him withdrawing, that led us to Jim Jordan. And Jim Jordan, you can see, fared a little bit better in the conference process, but he was riddled with a lot of other problems as well. So what kind of problems are those? Well, Jim Jordan is a founding member of the House Freedom Caucus. He's the current chair of the House Judiciary Committee, which allows him to have tremendous authority over what kind of witnesses and oversight of the federal government that Republicans are doing during a Democratic administration. Interestingly enough, in Jim Jordan's 16 years in Congress, he has passed 0 bills. He has also failed to get a single bill through the committee process during that 16-year tenure he's had in Congress. He's also a serial no vote on appropriations, which was a very big barrier. And as a result, you saw some interesting things happen on the floor with Jim Jordan's candidacy. He went for 3 rounds of balloting And in the first vote, he got 200 votes. That was the best that he performed. And for context, that was the worst that Kevin McCarthy performed in his bid for the speakership earlier this year. And Jim Jordan's problems did not get better. There's a lot of reasons for that, but we won't go into those tonight. You can see that in the second round of voting, he lost ground, and he continued to lose ground even into the third round of voting as well. As a result, he did not withdraw from the speaker race. Instead, the conference forcibly removed him as their candidate for Speaker of the House. And these are the folks that voted against him. You might see some familiar faces on there because a lot of these members are folks we work with very often, have powerful leadership positions, and come from rural America. I want to highlight specifically 3 of those members because I think it's an important dynamic that shapes up, and we're going to talk about that in particular. On the left, you have Don Bacon from Nebraska, arguably one of the most threatened Republicans running for re-election in 2024. He represents mostly Omaha, Nebraska, and Democrats are faunching at the bit to kick him out of that seat. As a result, he doesn't have the luxury of being able to back wildly conservative policies in the same way that someone like Jim Jordan, who's in a much more comfortably Republican district, is going to put through as Speaker. Kay Granger in the center there. She is the chair of the House Appropriations Committee, the committee that decides how the federal government spends money. And as a result, I said earlier that Jim Jordan is a serial no vote on any appropriations bill. And you saw Kay Granger, as a result, step up and push back against that nomination. And then on the right, this is a little known member of Congress, but he's famous for voting for John Boehner in the second round of balloting for Jim Jordan. So as a result, Republicans went back to the drawing board and they nominated, that says Steve Scalise, but it should say Tom Emmer, who's the majority whip. He was the speaker candidate for about 6 hours. And then it became very clear he did not have a path forward to securing the speakership on the floor. And so they had to go back to the drawing board again. And I think at this point, everybody knows what happens. This dynamic in the House shifted, and we got a new Speaker of the House was elected with every single Republican voting in favor of him, something we didn't think was going to happen, and that is Mike Johnson of Louisiana. And NCBA has a long history with Mike Johnson, and because we have such a unique insight into his legislative compass, so to speak, I wanted to kind of give you guys a little background, and I'm actually going to let Ethan do that because Ethan's been very involved with Mike Johnson since he first came to Congress in 2016. Ethan?
Thanks, Tanner. You know, a lot of the work that the NCBA DC office team does is engaging on issues as they pop up. We take on challenges as bills are introduced or as issues arise in the countryside. But another part of our portfolio back here is to build relationships across Washington. And that means reaching out to folks that may not have as heavy a hand in the ag policy arena or in the natural resources policy arena, and make sure that we're making friends and developing relationships throughout the federal government. Mike Johnson is one of those members that Colin Woodall and his time in my current job identified as somebody who sees the world the same way as NCBA members do, that sees the world the same way as our policy book does. And I agree with that, and we've continued that under my leadership of this office to back his campaign politically, fund him with our political action committee, engage with his office, and build relationships with him and his staff. We look for those members who support limited government, who understand the idea of a free market, and Mike Johnson fits that bill. He's been characterized all different kinds of inappropriate ways in the month or so since he took the speaker's gavel. But we know him to be a rock solid conservative, a principled conservative rather than a populist, and somebody that we believe we can work very well with as the Speaker of the House. So it's a move that, while it's been questioned and concerned by a lot of folks out there, from the cattle industry's perspective, this is a positive development and a strong choice for a leader of the House for this industry to work with. Tanner?
Thanks, Ethan. Just a couple things that add to Speaker Johnson's challenges in the political dynamics that we've been talking about here. There have been some vacancies made during this Congress, and you can see them on the screen. On the left-hand side are folks that have left Congress for various reasons. Congressman McEachin unfortunately passed away, and the other 2 have resigned. They have since been replaced, so the number of Republicans and Democrats has not changed. That being said, in the last couple weeks, there's been some new reports. This is George Santos. You might remember him from when he was Speaker of the House or President of the United States or Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. They have decided that he is not someone that they want to count in their midst, and as a result, he became only the 6th member of Congress to ever be expelled by the rest of the body. So he is no longer a voting member of Congress, and it will take New York quite a good amount of time to schedule a special election to replace him. Meanwhile, he is not voting. And just in the last 2 days, I'm sure many of you have seen the news, Kevin McCarthy is not expected to remain in Congress beyond December 31st of this year. And that creates a big problem for Mike Johnson, because you can already see how narrow the margins are in the House. Losing Congressman Santos takes the Republican count down to 221, and with Speaker McCarthy's exit at the end of the year, that's 220 to 213. And that is not a 7-vote delta, just for those keeping along at home. Speaker Johnson can now only afford to lose 3 Republican votes to pass legislation. And on that note, there are quite a few pieces of legislation that we have still yet to pass here. And that's something that we're going to talk about. I want to talk just a little bit about appropriations, because in a divided Congress like this, where the margins are so narrow and different parties control different levers of the lawmaking process, there obviously are only certain legislative vehicles that are going to pass. We call it must-pass legislation because up until now, it always has been considered must-pass. That's not always how folks in Congress see it these days. And appropriations rises to the top of the list. The Senate has only passed 3 appropriations bills out of 12. And for context, the current federal funding technically expired on September 30th. The House has gotten way better as they have moved along through this appropriations process. They've passed 9 or 10 appropriations bills or brought them to the floor. However, there was one very interesting bill that came to the floor, and it is the only appropriations bill to fail on the floor, and that's agriculture appropriations, the one that we do by far and away the most work in. That bill, when it came out of committee, already included around 8% cuts from previous year funding levels. Now, in Washington terms, that is pretty hefty slash and burn style appropriating. But that was not enough to satisfy some of the more extreme members of the Republican conference. They wanted to see far more cuts. And as a result, there were over 150 amendments filed to the appropriations bill when it came to the floor. Many of those slashing funding levels even deeper than that 8% and causing harm to some of those critical programs that farmers and ranchers depend on. In addition to that, there were a lot of harmful amendments to the cattle industry. We saw a direct attack on the beef checkoff and animal disease traceability. Fortunately, NCBA and our allies in the animal agriculture sector were successful in keeping some of those harmful amendments from getting adopted, but we weren't able to keep some of those deep funding cuts from getting passed. As a result, that bill failed on the floor, but it wasn't the Matt Gaetzes and the Lauren Boeberts of the world that tanked that bill. It was moderate farm state Republicans that knew that taking money outside of the farm safety net was not something that was going to fly back home and was not a good way to govern at this particular stage of the game. So as I think everybody is well aware at this point, Speaker Johnson successfully maneuvered a what he called laddered continuing resolution to keep the government open beyond November 17th. That means that half of the federal government will lose funding on January the 19th. The other half will lose funding on February the 2nd. And that means Congress has between now and January 19th to pass some sort of funding mechanism for the government. Speaker Johnson's already said he doesn't want to do another short-term continuing resolution. He wants to do something permanent. And if that doesn't work, we are looking at a long-term continuing resolution, and that is a lose-lose situation for everybody. So Congress is really under the gun right now to fund the federal government, and that's one of those pieces of must-pass legislation. The other piece of must-pass legislation is the Farm Bill, and that was extended through September 30th of next year as part of this laddered CR that Speaker Johnson navigated through the House and was subsequently signed into law by President Biden. Allison Rivera on our team covers all things Farm Bill, and she's going to give you all the latest on what's been going on with this very, very interesting set of circumstances that we've been dealt with. So Allison, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Tanner. Appreciate it. Appreciate everybody joining us today. I think Tanner and Ethan did a good job of explaining why we're sitting in a Farm Bill extension instead of talking about a new Farm Bill with hopefully what NCBA would like to see is some more dollars in certain spaces for some programs that are very important to cattle producers. We're sitting in an extension. However, the work continues. We will need floor time. Tanner mentioned that as well. Floor time to get pieces of legislation as large as the Farm Bill. You know, it's difficult to have committee floor time, both sides of Congress, and to get this bill done. And it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort, and we have very slim margins. I always try to remind people that one of the difficulties as we look at these slim margins is that every Congress, the districts that are represented by the agricultural districts that are represented by members of Congress continues to dwindle, and those urban districts continue to increase. And what's important to those members that represent agriculture across this country and our cattle producers is different than the members who represent urban districts. They care very much about the SNAP portion of the Farm Bill, and this over $1 trillion Farm Bill that we're continuing to work on. SNAP is going to be 85% of that bill, and sometimes that is a hard pill for some people to swallow. So one of the difficulties in not only floor time, but getting members of Congress, getting enough members of Congress to a yes vote. So we will continue the work. Tanner mentioned some checkoff language that was attempted through the appropriations process. That's something that we will continue to keep an eye on as we move forward with a Farm Bill and a markup in committee and on the floor, both House and Senate side. We also have our main priorities that we will continue to push for. In the last Farm Bill, NCBA was successful in creating the three-legged stool that we love to call it, which includes the foot and mouth disease vaccine bank. This is a US-only bank housed outside of the US, and in the case of a foreign animal disease outbreak like foot and mouth disease, vaccine will be able to be taken from antigen and turned into vaccine very quickly and shipped over here so that we can mitigate some of that continued risk and hopefully attack the problem very quickly. The other two pieces of that stool are the Nolan labs that we have across the country that do the diagnostic testing to help us to figure out what we're working with. And then, of course, those NADPREP grants that our states have been using. They are grants that people apply for to be better prepared for the case of foreign animal disease outbreak. We also are keeping a close eye, obviously, on the conservation title. These programs, these voluntary programs are very important to our producers like EQIP. We know that we have extra funding out there through the IRA. We want to make sure that those dollars are getting to cattle producers and that those programs are working to the best of their ability so that the money is there, but also the programs, if there's any kinks in them, that we have worked them out ahead of time in this Farm Bill. We're also going to make sure that we continue to prioritize disaster programs. You know, we're seeing drought in the South versus the West. There's a lot of programs in the disaster space that our producers unfortunately do need to be able to use throughout the year. We know that the weather is going to be there, and so we want to make sure those programs are viable and that they are there for our producers when they need to take advantage of them. And then another area that we have been seeing a huge uptick in is risk management programs for our cattle producers, particularly livestock risk protection has seen a huge uptick in usage. We're happy to see that. We want our producers to use these risk management tools. We want to make sure they know that they're available to them. We continue to work with USDA to expand these programs to meet the needs that are out there so that risk can be better managed. We learned a lot during COVID, and we want to continue to take the opportunity in this Farm Bill to take programs like LRP and make sure that they have the resources that they need. And the last piece I'll mention is that we really don't need to see a livestock title in this Farm Bill. Everything I've just mentioned we can take care of in other titles, including the miscellaneous title. Don't need livestock section. We will get this bill done, and we hope to get a little bit more funding across the board for a couple of these items that I just mentioned, particularly the foot and mouth disease vaccine bank. We know that the budgets are going to be tight, and that is going to be a heavy lift, but that is something that we are asking for and pushing for. And at the end of the day, we need to get a Farm Bill across the finish line and on time. We don't want to see another extension past September 30th of 2024 unless we have to, but the goal is absolutely to get this bill done next year. And with that, Ethan, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you, Allison. I'm actually going to send it right back to Rebecca to pick up from there and talk about traceability and fake meat.
Well, thank you,
Rebecca.
Ethan. It's a pleasure to get to join everyone this evening. First, I'm just going to talk about fake meat. So you can kind of think of that going into two different buckets. You have the plant side of things and plant-based. Then you have your cell-cultured products. First, just on the plant side of things, if you kind of look at COVID, it spoke for itself. Even when all the meat was out of the shelves, those products still sat on the shelves. So when folks didn't have anything to choose, they still didn't choose to eat those plant-based products. And so with that, you can kind of see that those stocks dropped. And so nonetheless, we still supported the Real Meat Act, which will enforce some labeling pieces to make sure that that's accurate, and support it as it was introduced in the Senate. But really our focus has shifted a little more over on the cell-cultured space. This year, there was 2 products, chicken products, that were approved by USDA. There are currently 2 restaurants, one in DC and one in San Francisco, that are selling in very limited quantities these products. They're still at a high price, and we've already seen some supply chain issues. Our stance as NCBA is that we're not afraid to compete, but we want to make sure that these products are on a level playing field. So there's 2 pieces that kind of come with that. One is making sure that they are held to the same inspection standards. And the second piece is making sure that they have accurate, transparent labeling. On the labeling front, we are watching USDA pretty closely. There's talk that there potentially could be a proposed rule and an opportunity for stakeholders to engage on the labeling piece. We are also working with the House and on the Senate side to make sure that we have legislation that's draft to also make sure that there's accuracy and transparency in that label so that consumers know when they go to the shelves that they are consuming cell-cultured products versus real meat. And on the inspection piece, there was an agreement between the Food and Drug Administration and USDA back in 2018, where on the cell-cultured products, on the kind of the creation of those cells, that is going to be under FDA, but the inspection of it will be under USDA. And again, we want to make sure that that is upheld, because that means that those products will have continuous inspection on a daily basis and be held to the same food safety standards as our product. The most important thing is that we don't want these products to come in and ride on the coattails of all the hard work and the high quality products that producers across the country put on the shelves. So we're watching that closely to make sure that, again, it's a level playing field. Then the second piece to this, or what I want to talk about, is animal disease traceability. And really coming from this is the concerns with foreign animal disease, specifically foot and mouth disease. Feel free to advance to the next slide. So really, from our stance, is that foot and mouth disease, it's endemic in most parts of the country, and it's in 2/3 of the world, mostly in parts like Africa, Asia, Europe. And so we really haven't had it in the United States since 1929, and we want to keep it that way. Feel free to advance to the next slide. The biggest thing is the economic impact that this would have. So if you look at reports that USDA APHIS has put out, it's estimated, and this is before COVID and inflation numbers, a $228 billion economic impact. That is because exports will stop immediately, and USDA's protocol will have a 72-hour standstill of all movement of cattle. And if you think about the impacts that the Holcomb fire has had, or even COVID on the supply chain, this would be 10 times worse. And then if you look further at the slide that's in front of you, you will see that Indonesia is endemic for foot and mouth disease, which is only 400 miles from Australia, which is a huge exporter. Go to the next slide, please. And so you can also see the risk is real and the risk is high because of all the movement with the air flights across the country. In addition, next slide, please. You can see also all the international container ships and the movement that you see there. So again, making sure that we have tools and resources available to us if we get a foot and mouth disease, that we are able to track it, trace it, and be able to stop the spread as quick as possible so we can get back to business continuity. So USDA APHIS has announced a proposed rule back in January. We submitted comments to this, so now we're kind of in the waiting period to see when they may release a final rule. That rule was taking our current traceability system and just transferring it to electronic identification. So it's quicker, more rapid ability to detect these diseases, again, so we can get back to business as normal. And this rule will affect only 11% of the cattle herd, which is your cattle that are 18 months of age or above that are moving interstate. So at NCBA, what we've done in addition, while we are waiting for that the final rule to be introduced, is we are working really hard to get funding for cattle producers through the appropriation process for those electronic identification tags. Even just this week alone, I know I looked at the steps on my phone from just being on the Hill with Tanner and my other colleague, Kelsey, and put in 10 miles just going to offices and making sure they know how important it is for us to get the funding for cattle producers. We also continue to have a working group in this space that's looking on the implementation of this to make sure, again, we have those resources available. And with that, I will turn it over to Kent to speak a little bit on international trade.
Thanks, Rebecca, and kind of following up on what she was saying with foot and mouth disease. One of the biggest concerns we've had recently is the fact that last month USDA approved Paraguay to be able to start sending fresh beef imports, fresh beef to the United States. As you know, Paraguay has a history of foot and mouth disease, like some of the other South American countries, and so, you know, we have been engaged with USDA for the past several months as they were considering whether or not to allow Paraguay. And we pointed out a lot of the issues that Paraguay has, and we called into question the level of safety that Paraguay could provide. You know, foot and mouth disease can enter as part of beef products, and so we want to make sure that anyone that has access to this market doesn't put us at risk. Well, we had major concerns with USDA's approval process and the fact that USDA APHIS relied on site visits in Paraguay from 2008 and 2014. A lot has changed since the last time USDA APHIS had boots on the ground in Paraguay. And so we asked for USDA to go back and to conduct a risk assessment based off of current site visits to make sure that the information that they're making this decision on is accurate and it's up to date. We also raised a lot of concerns about the fact that Paraguay relies heavily on private sector contributions to carry out their foot and mouth disease mitigation standards. So if you think about it, when 85% of your funding comes from the private sector, it's important that you have a strong economy that can actually, you know, support that. Unfortunately, Paraguay does not have that, and COVID was really devastating on their economy and on their cattle sector. So this really does call into question the accuracy and the quality of the information that USDA is relying on. So we've asked for Secretary Vilsack to just hit pause on this and deny those imports until a new assessment can be conducted. That request has been echoed in a bipartisan, bicameral way. We've seen a bipartisan letter from the House of Representatives, led by Congressman Tracy Mann and Congressman Jim Costa, where they were asking for a lot of the things that NCBA was requesting. This week, we've also seen the introduction of a bill in the Senate, led by Senator Rounds, Senator Tester, asking for the exact same thing. So we think that this is an issue that we're going to need to continue to address. But as of December 14th, Paraguay will be allowed to send their beef to the United States. And that should you know, raise alarms for everyone. So this is definitely an issue that NCBA is going to continue to lead on until we know that our concerns are addressed. And I also want to pivot to, I'm going to pivot to the next slide here. So in addition to a lot of the trade issues we've been working on, we're really preparing for tax reform, which is going to happen over the next couple of years. You know, we've been enjoying some tax relief, especially with the state tax and some of the other expensing mechanisms. All of that was secured in 2017 with your efforts, but in 2025, all that is set to expire. Well, we also have a lot of people in the House of Representatives that were not here the last time we had to have votes on taxes. So we're going to have to really educate a lot of these members of Congress about how any changes to the tax code could impact your family operations. The best way to do that
is to have recent, accurate information that helps tell that story. And this is where you come in. As you can see on the screen, we are conducting a tax survey. And I would encourage you that if you haven't already signed up for this, that you scan the QR code or you visit our website and take 5 minutes and fill out this form. This is an anonymous survey, so you don't have to provide your name or your email or anything. All we're asking for is your zip code so that we can take those results and we can share that in our advocacy based off of your state, your congressional district. But we want to know how these different tax policies affect you. And so we need your help. And so we're going to continue to gather this information through the end of the year until convention. And then we're going to wrap this up and launch all of our new advocacy efforts in March. But it really is going to take us about a year or so to educate all these members of Congress on the importance of these tax policies. So if you haven't done so, please take a few moments, take this survey, share this with your friends and neighbors, and help us gather as much information as possible. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sigrid, who's going to give you some updates on what's happening with our C team.
Thanks so much, Kent. So you've heard a lot of our legislative activity that Tanner and Allison outlined really well towards the end of the year here. There's one more bill that I'm going to add from our resource work that I think is worth noting. Introduced just this past month, the Black Vulture Relief Act in the Senate. This is a prime example of how NCBA's policy process works. We had concerns from producers on the ground in the Southeast and the Midwest who are experiencing a lot of depredation due to black vultures. We came up with a legislative solution. We got that bill introduced in the House over the summer. NCBA's Property Rights and Environmental Management Committee Chair, Charlie Bescher, testified before the House Natural Resources Committee on that issue. And now we have a Senate companion bill introduced as of about a week ago. So that's a piece of legislation that we'll be pushing forward towards the end of the year and into 2024 here. The rest of our legislative priorities, I think you've heard pretty well lined out through by Tanner and Allison. So I'm going to turn to a couple regulatory items that we've got going on in the natural resources space. One is sage grouse. If you're anywhere in the west of the United States, this is an issue you're very well familiar with. But the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, has been going through their process to revise over 70 RMPs related to sage grouse management for quite a while now, and we're finally nearing a next step in that process. We're likely to see, if you're a cooperating agency, you're likely to see their draft of those revised plans sometime tomorrow on Friday, which puts us likely to see it the rest of the public at some point in January. We're very eager to see where they've landed on that. We sort of had a draft of 5 alternatives put out, not really officially, but sort of in a pre-stage there of socializing their ideas, and they've got 5 alternatives in there. One is pretty much a reset to the 2015 sage-grouse plans, which we had some clear objections to due to the restrictions on grazing. One sort of winds the clock back to 2019, and 3 have a variety of changes to them and sort of varying degrees of friendliness to grazing. Again, we'll see what those, we'll see how those look when they come out in January, and we'll engage in the comment process at that point. But we've been involved up until now through our working group of submitting feedback to the agencies, and then also we had quite a few Western states who submitted through that process state-specific alternatives, which has been an enormous help to us, and we're optimistic that we're going to see some of that included in these drafts that come out tomorrow if you're a cooperator, or next month if you're a member of the general public. Another regulatory issue that we've had going on is grizzly bears. We saw last month an initiative from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to reintroduce grizzly bears to the North Cascades in Washington. This is part of their larger effort to bolster numbers for the species. We would argue those numbers are pretty strong already and are well on their way to being even more abundant as time goes on. You've seen that population grow pretty significantly in the GYE, in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and also in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem. And so we came out swinging and opposed that proposal along with about 14 of our affiliates, and we're going to have to continue to push back on that as we get closer to having a final rule out from Fish and Wildlife on that initiative. Also, another piece of interesting news, just while we're on grizzly bears, we've seen Montana and Wyoming come out with a plan now to sort of translocate and swap bears to improve the genetic diversity of their relative populations there in the GYE and the Northern Continental Divide. And that just, plays into our larger argument that we're constantly making on grizzly bears, on gray wolves, on a variety of predators. These animals are in recovery. The populations are growing both in number and in sort of genetic diversity and that strength from that perspective, and it's time to delist them across the lower 48. Speaking of delisting, gray wolves, we are coming up on the expiration of the 1-year abeyance, the 1-year pause essentially on our court case to delist gray wolves across the lower 48. That action will resume in February when that 1-year abeyance in the Ninth Circuit Court is up. We anticipate another request for an extension from the Fish and Wildlife Service there. And frankly, they're likely to get it in that court. We anticipate that the judge will probably go along with that. But we are moving closer and closer as we get more population surveys, as we see strengthening numbers with the Mexican gray wolf and that DPS. We just continue to have the pile of science supporting delisting gray wolves pile up before us. And so we saw a statement a few weeks ago from Fish and Wildlife that they are going to have a draft rule out by the time that court case abeyance expires in February. This is the federal government we're talking about, so fingers crossed on whether they stick to their own timing that they've set for themselves. But I think the consensus is becoming increasingly hard for them to ignore, both inside and outside of the agency. All of the science points to a delisting. So we're going to continue hammering on that, both in the court system and in the regulatory channels. One other item I want to mention on a regulatory front is the BLM's Conservation and Landscape Health Rule, or what they've sort of retermed the Public Lands Rule. This was an initiative that got rolled out in April. NCBA, along with numerous partners, about 60 other groups in the livestock sector and agriculture writ large, submitted comments opposing that rule this summer. If you're anywhere in the West, but truly if you're really nationwide, there's a lot of significance to this rule. There's a lot of concerns about how it will peel back grazing access for folks who are grazing on BLM land in the West. And it also sets a pretty troubling precedent when it comes to the designation of areas of critical environmental concern, or ACECs, which again, it's going to hit folks in the West first, but there's a lot there to be worried about, even if you're operating a little bit further east here or in the middle of the country. The ball is in the BLM's court on that rule right now. They received about 170,000 comments that they have to sift through now. And one thing that I think is pretty interesting is this week we had even just comments from some leadership at the BLM saying that they are backing off of their conservation language in that rule and reterming the lease system that was outlined in their proposal as restoration leasing. There's a certain amount of that that's substantive, but also it's, at the end of the day, there's a lot of that that's just semantics, and we still have the same core concerns we had before. Are you giving third parties the power to overlay a lease? You can call it a conservation lease, or you can say that it's a restoration project, but you're giving them the power to overlay a lease on top of someone's grazing permit, on top of their allotments, which is going to not only get in the way of how they're successfully managing and conserving that land and have done so for generations, but it threatens their access and their preference on those allotments. So we continue to oppose that initiative. Again, hopeful, hope for the best, plan for the worst. We are hopeful that they will incorporate some of our feedback into a final rule there, but we're still a long way from the finish line on that item. And when we do get a final rule out, we're going to have to evaluate how we minimize any negative impacts and whether that's another area for potentially some further action. One more item I want to mention, since we touched on some litigation. The BLM was recently sued by WWP, by the Western Watersheds Project, and a group called PEER, regarding what they called a pretty reckless and systematic lack of NEPA being done on grazing allotments. This is an attack that we've heard before. It's as baseless now as it was then, and really it's just aimed at the end of the day at, again, eroding that grazing access across the West, getting more folks off their allotments and reducing the overall number of AUMs that folks are able to turn out on public lands. This is something that NCBA is getting involved to oppose. We see the threat there not just to Western producers, but to folks nationwide. Anytime there's an attack on one segment of the industry, that's going to have ripple effects across the country. So it's another prime example of one of these Western public lands issues that has ramifications, in a larger sense across the country. So we are getting involved. We filed 2 motions in the DC Circuit Court regarding that case, one to gain intervener status and one to dismiss the case outright. We're not going to see any action on those 2 motions until January, but those have been filed now, so we're in the game when it comes to that case and when it comes to defending public lands grazing across the West. that's a lot in a short amount of time, but I think, we've got a lot of issues wrapped up, as Tanner outlined, in the appropriations process. We'll continue pushing along that timeline, but I think for now, I'll turn it back over to Michaela to kind of walk through how we're going to do Q&A, and then we'll move on with the rest of our program.
Great, thank you so much, everyone, for providing such great updates. We just have one really quick question here in the question box. If someone could provide an update on the Packers and Stockyards Act rules, what's the status and what can we expect?
Thanks, Michaela. Yeah, so USDA's Packers and Stockyards rules. For those of you that have been around NCBA for a long time, you've heard us as early as 2010 refer to those as the GIPSA rules. And just boiling what is ostensibly 102 or 15 years of history into about 30 seconds, if finalized, those rules would severely impact our ability to utilize alternative marketing arrangements and contracts to trade fed cattle to packers. And that, of course, has significant upstream effects on the rest of the supply chain as well. In an effort to facilitate fairness in the marketplace, USDA has taken an inch and stretched it into a bureaucratic mile and wants to be involved at every step of the way in the marketplace when we trade livestock. So these rules are very harmful. NCBA has been opposed to them going back to 2010, and USDA is trying again. They've gotten a little bit craftier this go round. Instead of one massive rule, they've broken it up into 3 smaller rules. And we've seen a bunch of different stuff in the past several months on that. So the first rule deals with the poultry tournament system. NCBA, of course, does not have policy on that, but that rule was proposed and finalized just a couple weeks ago. In the meantime, USDA has proposed a second rule dealing with what it calls inclusive competition and integrity in the marketplace. That rule has been sent over to the White House for approval, but has not been finalized yet. And the third rule, this is the one that makes us the most nervous because it would roll back the long-standing harm to competition standard, which is a very base landmark, or I guess core tenet of competition law, regardless of which statute you're talking about. And USDA wants to upend the will of 8 federal circuit courts and the intent of Congress by rolling that standard back. We have not seen that rule come out of USDA yet, but we are not sitting around waiting for them to get their butt in gear. We are expecting this to come down the pipeline anytime now. And so as a result, we have engaged with Congress through the appropriations process to try and get that rule nullified before it can even take full force and effect. We were successful in getting language to do just that in the House version of the appropriations bill, but that language did not appear in the Senate. Rebecca was 100% correct when she said in the last 2 weeks alone, we've probably put about 10 miles of road work into the House and Senate office buildings, talking about traceability, but also talking about this issue, trying to make sure lawmakers understand just how harmful the effects of these Packers and Stockyards rules would be for cattle producers of all sizes, and trying to impress upon them the importance of Congress engaging, just like they did in a bipartisan basis in 2012, to prohibit them from taking full force and effect. I am confident that we will continue to move the ball down the field, but again, going back to the very beginning of this webinar, a lot of it comes down to what the political dynamics are underlying in terms of whether they can move an appropriations bill or not. So I'm optimistic. There are other tricks we have up our sleeve to prevent these rules or even stall them. So if there are other questions on that, my email is on the screen. I'd be happy to chat with folks about the implications of those regulations.
Great, thanks Tanner for providing that update. I just want to say thank you, Ethan and team, for all your hard work you do in DC on behalf of the cattle industry, and for your time tonight providing a meaningful update. I also want to encourage all attendees to register and attend a cattle convention in Florida from January 31st to February 2nd. You can register at convention.ncba.org. There will be a really extensive, really popular DC issues update session there that Wednesday morning. So encourage everyone to register and attend that. And with that, thank you everyone for joining, and have a good night.